Leadership is complex and has been studied for a long time. But how do we bring all that has been learned about it and connect the dots for leaders in the real world? Well, because you're watching or listening, I know you care about being a more effective leader. And so we're here to help you figure out how to connect those dots. We're going to do that based on research today, which makes it all the better for our own learning and growth. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger positive difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you are listening to this podcast, you could have joined us live. Well, I guess in the future, you could join us live, and you can find out how to do that from the live stream on your favorite social media platforms. You can find out when we're having those lives and how you can join us by joining either our Facebook or LinkedIn groups, which are two of the places where these are live streamed. You can go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to get connected, get advised, and get this information sooner. Today's episode is brought to you by my latest book, Flexible Leadership, Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. It's time to realize that styles can get in our way and that by following our strengths, we might not always be achieving the best approach. In a world more complex and uncertain than ever, leaders need a new perspective, a new set of tools to create the great results their organizations and team members want and need. That's what Flexible Leadership provides you. Learn more and order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/flexible. Well, with that, it seems like it's the logical time to bring in my guests. So let me bring them on stage one at a time, and then let me navigate back so I can introduce them appropriately. Let me do that. My guests today are Margaret Moore and Jeffrey Hull. Margaret Moore, MBA, blends leadership, coaching, and science, including 30 years in C-suite roles, co-leading 4 successful startups in biotech and coaching, and 2 decades of professional coaching and coach training. For 25 years, she's been a prolific translator of science into coaching, training, and leadership practice. Jeffrey Hull, PhD, has focused on leadership for over 30 years as an HR leader with multiple corporations, co-founder of a leadership development consultancy, a nonprofit executive director, and coach to leaders across the globe. He brings years of translating science into leadership as a consultant, psychologist, and teacher at New York University and Harvard Medical School. Together, they have written a research-based book titled The Science of Leadership, 9 Ways to Expand Your Impact. And welcome to both of you. And Jeffrey, to you, welcome back.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Jeffrey was on the show like 6 years ago, we determined a few minutes ago. So we'll put that link to that in the show notes if you want to go back and listen to Jeffrey and I's conversation about one of his previous books. I really want to know, I want to start, actually, I'm going to start, I didn't even have this in my list. I want to start, the last word in the subtitle is the word impact. I think all three of us would agree that leadership, especially great leadership, has the chance for great impact. Why did you pick that word in the subtitle? Why did you want to take that? I mean, I know that book titles are all intentional, so there's a reason there. I'd really love to know why you picked that word.
Gosh, I don't remember all the reasons that we thought about, but, I think you'll relate to this, Kevin. Leadership is more than business, right? Business is making money. Leadership is impact. Leadership is, and the way the researchers measure leadership is they measure the performance of followers, the workforce, the employees, not the leaders. It's not about your performance as the leader. It's about what you leave behind, the legacy. I mean, not everybody's into legacy. You might not be at that stage of life, but it's bigger than business or, organizational success. It is, and its impact on self, others, organizations, the world Jeff writes about, regenerative and the planet. It is about more, and hopefully that lasts. you know that data that shows that when people are billionaires, they have all this money, that money gets burnt through in a couple generations. It doesn't last. But legacy, and impact, they last. So I think it's about making a difference in a way that lasts and gets carried on.
Thank you. So Jeffrey, how did you guys come to do this book and do this book together?
Wow, well, that was quite a journey.
I even have the word journey down below there.
There you go. Well, it has been quite a journey, and it's actually been a lot of fun, a lot of hard work, great collaboration, and in many ways for me, I'd have to say a joy to have such a great co-author and to work with someone that I've known for many, many years. And I had started a journey for a new book around leadership with Barrett Kohler about 2 years ago, and was in conversations with the publisher and editor and trying to hone in on a theme. And there were a lot of different options. And at a certain point, the editor discovered a project, a smaller project that Margaret and I had conducted with the Institute of Coaching, where we are both leaders. And this was coming out of the pandemic. And we had, with a group of our senior coaches, we had done a mini qualitative survey of how things had changed coming out of the pandemic. And from that, there was a written report, and the publisher read the report and was thrilled. He was like, wow, this is so cool. And we were like, yeah, but that was mini and it was tiny and it was right out of the pandemic. And he said, well, why don't you take this kind of idea and expand it? And I said, I'd love to do that, but I couldn't do that without my colleague, Margaret, because she was really the primary driver of that writing. And he said, well, why don't you ask her? So I did. And the rest is history. I mean, we basically sat down together with the publisher and recognized that there was all this amazing research available to us as coaches. We had been translating coaching research for our coaching communities. Much of it was around leadership and well-being. And we realized in our conversation that a lot of this research exists around leadership, like how to be an effective leader in today's world has been studied for many, many years. But so much of this scientific basis is locked up in academic journals. And I don't know about you, but I think it's safe to say that most of my clients do not spend their time reading academic journals on leadership. So it just became an obvious opportunity and for us to step back and translate this research into something useful, accessible, and to a certain extent with a coaching mindset, because we're both coaches. We're not academic researchers, but we have been involved with the science underpinning coaching for years. And so it was just a natural evolution. Let's look at the leadership literature and then find a way to create an accessible, usable, practical approach that brings this work, this really profound research, to the mainstream audience.
Margaret, anything you want to add to that before I ask you the next question?
The most important thing is that we are channeling the scientists. That's what we're doing. We created the framework. We organized it in a way that's flexible and whole, and that was our contribution, coming from a number of places. But we are channeling what the researchers are telling us, and at this moment in time, when I was in MBA school 40 years ago, there wasn't a science of leadership. Now there are meta-analyses, and so basically we're at a place where, just take humility, there's 212 studies that were reviewed in one study. So it's not just one study, it's 200. It's 150 of this, 250 of servant leadership. So there's a lot of data now, and you can find the signal in the noise. And so bringing that to everyday leaders and coaches is really important. I mean, this was really important work to do.
Which actually leads right into my next question, Margaret. So there is a tremendous amount of research. How did you tell us about how you researched the research, if you will? Like, how did you decide? Like, if you read all 212 on humility and you read all 122 on, so I mean, like, at some level, help us understand how you decided to get your arms around it. Like, I think at this point, everyone who's watching or listening has a picture of where I mean, we're going to unpack some of this for everybody. But like, how did you get from what Jeffrey said to like, how did you pick? Tell us about the research.
Right. Well, I should start by saying my first career was in biotechnology. So I worked exclusively with scientists and researchers. I led R&D programs. Biotech companies are basically research and development companies. So I was familiar with reading literature. The first thing you do is you go for high quality studies. We had a list of topics that came out of lots of sources, but there's a lot of frameworks that coaches use, that leaders use, that are familiar. So we started there, although we didn't just take them as they were. We took the essence of them, and then there's 100 topics in leadership research at least. So we kind of got these 9 topics, and then we organized, like humility went in servant leadership, visionary leadership went into transformational, forgiveness in leadership is a study, is in relational. So we looked for the main topics, and we looked for high quality studies, and we looked for the top journals. So we didn't do small studies with 20 people or 50 people. We went after the largest studies. We were already familiar with a lot of it. We just had to fill it out. It took about 2 months of gathering data, putting it into lists, and then writing it up from there. So you start with the latest, and then you organize it, and then you start to write, and you let it in. The writing is informed by what the data said. So one topic led to the next. So there's a natural order there that comes when you put it all together. So yeah, so it's just good old-fashioned work that AI would not have been able to do.
Well, I wondered if you'd say that.
At least not.
You talked about the framework. There are nine capacities. We'll talk about those in a second. But you started there, like you had done some things to do that, and then brought the research in, as opposed to the other way around. I'm not complaining.
A bit of both. But yeah, we knew that we had the list of topics, that just because we've been gathering it for 20 years. What are and also there are topics that are common to coaching and well-being. That's the interesting thing. Even though we stayed with the studies on leadership, they're both very familiar to us, because we know about positive psychology, and we know about relationships, and we know about transformation, and we know about agility. We already know a lot of these things. It's just that we weren't starting from scratch. We already had a pretty good command. When you coach people, the same topics come. I mean, I bet I heard you talk about your book in another podcast. Flexibility is it today, not strengths-based. Peter Drucker got us this far, build on your strengths. Now you have to become a whole. You have to round out your repertoire.
So before we get to the 9 capacities, and everybody, we'll list them out. We do not have time to dive into all 9, but we'll talk about that a little bit. But before that, you've identified that within the 9 capacities, they fall into, I'm going to say, 3 segments, or 3 focus areas. So Jeffrey, tell us about those 3. They really map with what we talk about. We use different words, different words. But I'd love for you to talk about those 3 segments and why they're all important, back to this word impact.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that what Margaret was pointing to is that we realized we could not cover the world. I mean, it's a huge pantheon of leadership literature. So you have to keep in mind that as we went through the journey of reviewing the studies, we also had a coaching mindset throughout the whole time. And we were thinking about, how does this apply in our coaching, that we work with leaders? And it started sort of to naturally fall into buckets, because these are the kinds of issues that come up with our clients. And so as we took the topics one by one, we realized that there is a flow, there's a natural flow that leaders go through. It's like a journey they take, that starts with grounding it within themselves. Like before you can start to fix a system, you have to start with yourself. So we looked at what are the core capacities, as we call them, or the capabilities that are related to developing oneself as a leader. And then it felt natural to evolve from internal to external. And as we looked at those domains that are external, it became very clear that the first level of that is your team, is your relationships with the people you influence, the people you impact directly, like right around you, your colleagues, your peers, your direct reports. So the first level was yourself. The second level was your team and working in with relationships with others. And then ultimately, when we looked at the most sophisticated research, it starts to look at the bigger picture. And that includes things like servant leadership and transformational leadership and distributed or shared leadership. And that's shifting from sort of an I to a we mindset and looking at the bigger picture. And it became kind of natural that as we work with leaders, those are the stages we go through in coaching. So why not make the journey in the book applicable to the way it is in the real world?
Sounds logical. So you talk about self, others, and organization.
Right.
I use 3 O's: outcomes, others, and ourselves, and they really map. I mean, they're the same.
Love that.
They're the same thing, right? And so, what I'd like you to do now is, so there are 3 of the capacities, as you just said, Jeffrey, in each of those 3 areas. So, Margaret, here's what I want to do. I want you all to give us. I'll have you go back and forth. Like we'll do the first 3, Margaret, then Jeffrey, you can do the next 3, etc. But what I just want a couple of sentences about each, because we really, by the way, everybody, you're going to want a copy of the book, so you might as well just take care of getting that ordered now. The Science of Leadership: 9 Ways to Expand Your Impact. It's if you're with us live, it's coming out in about 2 weeks, and if you're with us after the podcast comes out, it's already out. So go ahead and get your copy. So we're not going to go deeply into each one, but I want everyone to know sort of what the framework is, and then I'm going to ask you some general questions about them. So Margaret, tell us about the 3 that are the self-focused 3.
Well, good. So it starts with conscious, which is that you are present, you see clearly, you're calm, and you're objective. And those are hard things to do because we have all this emotional noise and busy mind here. And so it maps to mindfulness, it maps to self-awareness. And we took it a step further with emotional integration, which means that the noise in your mind, the ego noise of a leader, ultimately turns into a quieter ego. That's the journey of leaders, which is why the more senior leaders speak more slowly, are more powerful, and see things more clearly. So that's conscious. The second is authentic, and that is the fire in us. That's our values, what we care about. So that's purpose, virtues, values, character, all those things. They sit in a lot of different frameworks, but authenticity is really the starting point. But the second piece is that you also really care about the authenticity of others. So that's the heart. The agile is the basis for everything, as you know. Your brain, you need to be mentally agile, going from big picture to little details, up and down the elevator, many times a day. You've got to go from adversity to resilience. You need to go from one extreme of a conflict to the other. We've got this polarized world. You're basically bouncing around your brain, using all of it, up and down, body, you might as well be an athlete, a mental athlete. So that's agility. So those are the 3.
Yeah.
You're awake, you're genuine, you care, like your heart singer in this, and you're able to bounce around.
And so the next 3 are the others, or the about other people, about the team. Jeffrey, walk us through those 3.
Sure. So when you step from agile into the broader, you start to move outward into the organization. The first step is going to be an obvious one, which is relational. And it starts right close to home with relationships with the people that you work with your peers, your direct reports. And it looks like things like coaching and mentoring and creating a space for psychological safety. And it's really about having those core connective tissues with others, like empathy is in this space.
Mhm.
And we love the research of a colleague of ours named Colin Fisher, who did some wonderful work on how not to be a micromanager. And just to give you one taste of the research, he and his colleagues studied project management, and they came away with two key themes, which are really, I find them very profound with my clients, which are guiding rather than dictating, and path clearing, like clearing the path for your team to be able to follow through. So those are sort of relational activities that you get engaged in. The next is positive psychology or positive leadership. And this we call strengthening, because it's really, how do you create an environment that elevates the capabilities and capacities of all the people that you interact with? And this is where we do a pretty deep dive into positive psychology. And this has been around now for 20 years. And there are core principles of positive psychology around efficacy, meaningness, motivation. And so the research in positive psychology is incredibly helpful for coaches. And we tried to distill it down to sort of the core premise that leaders can use to bring a qualitatively optimist type environment and stay also away from what we would call toxic positivity, which is, the rose-colored glasses, or everything is always wonderful. It's not about that. It's about being realistic and optimistic and building resilience and competencies. So that's the positive domain. And then the third level in the sort of next outer domain is compassionate leadership, which is a relatively new kid on the block in terms of research. And I think Margaret and I kind of debated, like, where would we put compassion and how does this fit in? But what we came to realize is that compassion is sort of this integration of all that has come before: consciousness, agility, positive, relational, and then beginning to see how that impacts the wider world. And we chose to use the word resonate. Like, if you're really a compassionate leader, you will be able to resonate with the pain, the suffering, the challenges, the traumas that we all go through as human beings. And to actually get to that place is more than empathy. It's broader, it's deeper, and it's truly a more sophisticated way of being in the world. And there's some really good studies around compassion. It's becoming, I would say, it's sort of one of the more recent areas of research. So those are the three in that domain, moving outward.
And then most everyone who's here is what I would call a capital L leader. You have a leadership title or role of some sort. And so at some point you have to talk about this third segment, this third domain, that being Absolutely. The organizational results piece. So Margaret, why don't you talk about the last three?
Let's do that. Yeah. Well, the next one, I was just doing a workshop on this in Mexico last weekend, and this one had the lowest score. Leaders. So shared leadership. So shared leadership is where, as a leader, before you proclaim from your perch the vision, the purpose, and the strategy, you in fact share the process of building those with not just the top C-suite and the top SVPs and EVPs, but you get it down as far as you can go. And there's a wonderful story. It's called Open Strategy, that was done with a European insurance company with 50,000 employees. Brand new CEO, stock price doing terribly. He had 4 months to turn it around. He got a group of 40 frontline, like shop floor, like people in the insurance company. It took them 4 months before they could talk in his language, before they could actually share their ideas in a way that was system wide. And when they put out their new strategic plan, the share value went up $18 billion. So it's worthwhile, but it took months to get these people who are not used to talking the language. So that's like shared leadership on the front lines, is that because as a leader, you say, I don't have time to bring these people along. They don't understand what's going on in the world. They've only got, this bird's eye view. But when you go the extra mile, and Kevin, this is probably our answer to engagement, is to engage people in the direction setting, right? It doesn't get talked about, but I think that's the real deal. So that's the hardest one. Servant leadership is hard because and most of us do this in small doses, we're not Mother Teresa, but you really are in this place of service, and you're humble, you forget about yourself, you're there to help others do their best. And so we all could use a little more of that. And it's a bit more than authentic values, because your values still might not go as far as service. The last one, which is the penultimate, because everything up until this point makes it go better, is transformational. It's the most studied leadership topic. It's actually boring because people have known about it for so long. 40 years it's been around. Bernard Bass, who founded Leadership Quarterly. But it turns out there's lots of things that you can add to it. There's now a science of inspiration. So if you're going to be an inspirational leader, what do you do to make that happen? How do you get people to lift their feet off the ground, turn the light on, and see possibilities they've never seen before? Now there's some ways to do that. My favorite is this concept of novel problem formulation. Okay, so transformational leadership is about taking your challenge, even your biggest challenge, and turning it into strength and opportunity. This is the answer to Peter Drucker. You take the worst and you turn it into the best. And the science around formulating problems says that the bigger and more diverse your landscape of the problem, the more perspectives you've considered, the more innovative the solution. So this is where you're agile, looking at all these different approaches, you're compassionate to all the different voices, and when you put it all together and then you add a little bit of intuition, you get this transformational solution, which all goes better when all the other things are working well.
So now, everybody, you have the overview of the framework and the capacities in connection to self, others, and organization. And so I'm curious, I'm going to ask you both this question, but I'm going to have you go first, Jeffrey. Of the 9, which do you think is either misunderstood or misapplied most?
The two that pop, I'm not sure I can give you one.
Okay, go ahead.
Two pop into my mind immediately, and I always follow my intuition. They are conscious leadership and servant leadership. And I think maybe the reason they both pop into my mind is that there's a lot of overlap between being a servant, which is kind of leading from behind and requiring humility and respect for yourself and for others. And conscious leadership is challenging because it requires you to be willing to be objective about yourself. And then that leads to the question of, how do I become objective about myself? Is it even possible to become objective or see what we like to call see clearly? And it requires feedback. It requires you to actually listen to how you're perceived, pay attention to how you're perceived by others. And I think these are very challenging for all of us, right? We may think we're in service of a bigger picture, but we may not be aware that we're being kind of autocratic, or we are taking up a lot of space, or we're not listening, or we're spending all our time on our phone. All of those things are connected, right? Because if you're not aware and present to how you show up in the world as a leader, your physical, your emotional, your mental state, you can't really come across as a true servant. And all of the others become problematic. So to answer your question, I think conscious leadership is the reason why it's the ground on which everything else is built. is the most challenging, but the core. And we spend quite a bit of time talking about that in terms of the research and in terms of coaching. There's case studies in the book about how we actually recommend you work through some of those issues, because that's going to be the foundation to be successful.
Margaret, do you have a different answer or anything you want to add?
I want to add one thing about compassion that won't be obvious, because I think it comes from a place of a deep understanding of all the forces operating on you, and respect, which is the basis for strategy. So compassion, if you really understand and listen to and respect and appreciate, and you don't treat one group differently than another, and you really get it all, you are primed for the best possible strategy. So I don't think it's obvious that compassion is the basis for great strategy. So I would add that. And then that one thing that we're bringing to everybody's attention is this concept called a quiet ego. And I want to point that out as well, because right now we don't have a lot of role models of quiet egos. There's a over-indexing of our emotions, as if that they're really important for everyone to experience them, and that's not true. The most impact you can use your emotions, but they're like a dog on a leash. You only let it run once in a while. And I think that the better you are at bringing a quiet ego to the fore, the more impactful you are. You use the noise once in a while, but you use it very carefully.
I want to say to everybody listening that I actually had a lower third I could have put up there about ego. And you answered it, and you mentioned it earlier, and you mentioned it again, Margaret. And so I hope that all of you who are listening, did a mental underline of that. I find, having done around 500 of these, that there's usually at least one thing from an episode that is the thing that I will remember and connect to my guests. And I'm confident from reading the book. There's lots of things I love about this book. And you've done a real service around what you've done around researching the research, as I said earlier. But it's this idea of the quiet ego, or quieting our ego, is probably the thing that I will personally take from our conversation and from the book as probably the biggest thing. I think it's a really important point. You've talked about it in a really useful way, both in the book and in what you just said, Margaret, so I really appreciate that. Before we finish, I have a question that I always ask. I'm going to ask both of you, and I guess it's your turn, Jeffrey, so you get to go first. You already talked. This is the only thing that everybody that everybody that's listening knows. They knew I was going to ask what I'm about to ask. And Jeffrey said, well, I've got 8. I said, well, maybe don't give us 8. The question is, what are you reading these days?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you gave us a little bit of a heads up, because otherwise I'd be looking at my Kindle and saying, oh God, what am I reading in the last 24 hours?
Which is why I try to do it ahead. Exactly right.
But it's actually a really great question and great timing, because especially connecting the dots with the quiet ego, which we did focus on a lot in the book, and the research from a wonderful book. And Margaret, remind me the name of the book,
Transformative
Self by Jack Bauer. I'll let Margaret say more about that, but that's also an amazing book. The book that I just finished reading that connects all of this, though, is called The Trauma of Everyday Life by a wonderful Buddhist psychiatrist named Brian Epstein in New York. He wrote a book called Thoughts Without a Thinker, which is a very famous book from quite a few years ago. And one of his most recent ones is called The Trauma of Everyday Life. And it's a really beautiful book. And it's a lot about bringing some of the baseline Buddhist principles into our everyday world. And then I'll quickly mention another one that I love right now called Rise Above, which is written by a good friend of mine and of the Institute of Coaching, Barry Scott Kaufman, who is best known for sort of updating Maslow's hierarchy of needs with his recent book on the transcendent self, I think it's called. But His newest book is called Rise Above, and it's also really, really excellent approach to bringing what he calls moving out of a victim mindset. So I encourage you to read both of those along with ours.
All right. Well, absolutely. Margaret, what are you reading these days?
Right. So there's a wonderful new documentary out on Mark Twain. So start there because he's an amazing cataloger of the human experience. And I'm reading the new book called James. I just barely started, Percival Everett, which is the Black person's perspective on Huckleberry Finn. So I'm looking forward to that as a mind expander. The other thing is that I'm reading a lot about AI, including Harari's new book. So I do think that humans are downloading into the AI psyche their own patterns. So, like if you just compare different AI services, they have different personalities. And I think our book provides a simple framework for people developing AI, for people developing AI, for AI to help leaders and for AI to lead. I think we have to make a conscious effort to download into the AI psyche what we need and not this competitive. I describe a lot of AI like a virus, which means it's got the energy of wanting to take over its host. You can feel it. But the living world is one of cells, and cells live in cooperation with their fellow cells. And we need to turn AI into more of a living, cooperative, collaborative mode. And I do think that requires real leaning in. And so I'm trying to understand the zeitgeist, including coaching AI leaders as much as I can, to do what we can to help human leaders lead AI.
We've been talking with the authors of the new book, The Science of Leadership: 9 Ways to Expand Your Impact. And I know that you can learn more at scienceofleadership.com, but either of you want to tell us a little bit more about where they can connect with you, where they can learn more, or is there anything else that you want to tell us about connecting and reaching out to you before we finish up?
I just want to thank you for this great conversation, mostly. You've got the website there on your screen, and the book comes out July 15th, so it may already be out or not, depending upon when this gets, when you get a chance to see this. And I think I would just add that we love being in dialogue with our readers, as we've loved being in dialogue with the researchers. As Margaret said at the outset, this book has been kind of an honoring of the scientists. And so if you are a researcher or you actually are interested in that side of things, reach out to us. I'm on LinkedIn, Margaret's on LinkedIn. We love conversations. We're coaches, so we're people persons. Writing books is not our primary focus. So we look forward to hearing from everyone.
Scienceofleadership.com, everybody. Now, before we finish, I'm going to ask all of you the question. I'm done asking my guest question. I'm going to ask you a question. It's the question I ask you every single episode. If you've been here before, you know what I'm about to ask you. The question is, now what? What are you going to do with what you just heard? Maybe you're going to go buy a book or 2 or 5, depending on which ones that you found interesting. Maybe hopefully, there's multiple things that you just heard that you found interesting, that stopped you in your tracks mentally. The question is, what are you going to do with those things? Not just, hey, that was interesting. Hey, I really ought to do something about that. What am I going to do? What are you going to actually do? What action will you take? Because until you take action, until you move from knowing to doing, nothing's really significantly going to change. And so I encourage you to do that. When you do that, you get far more value from the time that you just spent with us. And so I want to thank Margaret and Jeffrey again for being here, and to remind all of you that if you love this, tell somebody else that they need to come watch or listen. And wherever you happen to be watching or listening to this, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes, because next week, I promise, there'll be another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.